Hey guys, if you're coming from my last video about installing Dragon Quest X and its English translation tools, a couple things have been updated since then, namely Clarity as of an hour ago. This new version of Clarity has a bunch of new features as well as a new user interface, which makes it super easy for players to install and run Clarity as well as its advanced features now. So this video is going to be going over how to install, run, set that up, and kind of what that looks like. One thing I want to mention before we get started here is to please read the README, as if anything goes wrong or you're not able to figure something out, my ability as well as Clarity's creator's ability to help you hinges on us knowing that you've read through that README and have done or seen everything there, all the FAQs and bug fixes and all that. So yeah, go ahead and read that README first. Even though I know you're watching this video, please make sure that you take a look at that. So to get started, the first thing we're going to do is download Clarity. You can see I already have it here. We're going to extract it. We now have the Clarity main directory. And in order to run Clarity correctly, I'm including a link in the description alongside the link to Clarity itself to the specific version of Python that you're going to need to install and add to your path in order to safely run Clarity without any issues. We've seen people who have different versions of Python where Clarity hasn't worked because its dependencies were for the wrong version. The most important thing is that it's the 32-bit version of that specific version that will be in the description. And the other thing you're going to want to do is when you're installing that version of Python, you're going to want to make sure that you add it to your path. When you boot the installer for that version of Python, there's going to be an option at the bottom that says add Python to path, and you're just going to want to go ahead and make sure that you check that when you're installing Python. So now the rest of this video is going to be assuming that you did what I just told you to, and you now have the correct version of Python both downloaded, installed, and added to your path. So once that's all done, you can go ahead and run clarity.exe. You can see there's a bunch of options here that you can choose from. Again, read the README, it's right here in the UI. These options do pretty much what they did in the last version of Clarity, at least as far as like pulling latest files from the translation server, which I'll go over again. We add and change the translation for the game all the time. Keeping this checked basically means that you're having the most up-to-date translation, and now we also have the ability to translate player names and NPC names as well. Debug log is always helpful if you have a problem, and I'll go over this in a bit. So the first thing you're going to want to do is run Clarity. Just just run it. The reason being is you have to create your venv folder, your virtual environment. So once you run Clarity for the first time, it's going to do this. It's going to generate a bunch of stuff. It's going to take a little while. It's either going to tell you, when it's finished, it's either going to tell you to run Dragon Quest X with Clarity again, or it'll just start translating. Since my game is open, it's just going to start translating. So once this is done, let it go, let it start, let it grab the latest files, let it translate. Just try not to interrupt it, whatever it does. If it tells you to close it, great, close it. So once that's done, we can go ahead and close it. And I can go ahead and transition into talking about one of the new features that Clarity has in the new version. So it's the experimental translate dialogue feature that I want to go over. It's brand new to this version of Clarity, and what it basically does is it replaces Akmon in a way. So what that means is where Akmon would talk to a translation API service and then return that translation and store it into an overlay, well, Clarity can now basically do that same thing, but instead of storing it into an overlay, it can now store it into the game itself, into the dialog box, which is fantastic. It means that eventually Clarity will probably eat Akmon in its entirety. There's a couple things I want to mention about this feature that I will both talk about and show later in the video. The first of which is when you enable this, you might notice that the game pauses when you talk to NPCs, and this is because you're still doing everything Akmon had to do, And you're also injecting it into the game now. And what that means is you're pinging a translation API service that's returning a translation. And not only do you have to wait for that to complete, but you also have to inject it into the game. Now that doesn't take very long, but altogether, it can take 1 or 2 seconds to actually display the text. So that's one of the reasons why this feature is experimental. The other reason is, although it's much more stable than the previous pre-release of Clarity that we were on before this one, you might still see a couple invalid call crashes every once in a while. We know why they're happening, but they're still being ironed out. One other cool thing about this feature is once you've spoken to an NPC that we don't have in our database files that ship with Clarity, it will actually create a new file, or a new folder rather, in this directory called new ad hoc dumps. And down the line, we're working on a bot that will zip that folder up, and you will be able to send it to us in a Discord channel to be processed into the master weblet database that we will ship with Clarity, basically removing the need to translate that same piece of dialogue again in the future. So what that means is, with all this, you'll be able to effectively contribute to the translation contribution just by playing the game and grabbing us those files. So that's cool. So that's basically what this experimental translate dialog does. If you open the translation settings, you'll see a very similar layout to Akmon, where it asks for a lot of the stuff I mentioned in my previous video. If you followed that video, which hopefully you have because you will still need to install the game, you'll recognize that I talk about DeepL Translate and the DeepL API, and you're going to want to grab that information from Akmon and plug it into here. And then once you do so and run the game, I won't show it in this video. You can do it on your own. It's simply because I just don't want to fill out this information right now. But once you do all this, the game will translate text in dialogue rather than in Akmon's overlay, assuming that you're not running Akmon alongside this. So I'll kind of show you just what this looks like right now. So once we have all this set up, we're basically ready to start translating. So all we have to do is hit run DQXclarity again. And we already have our virtual environment, so we don't need to regenerate that. It'll grab the latest files from the weblet server. Great. Newest translation. And now it's not only translating the game, but it's also translating NPC and player names, which we previously had very limited access to. So you can see here, you can choose an adventure log. Go ahead and log into the game here. See, everything is in English so far, just like before. Draki notifications are in English. Now you can see that NPC names and player names are also English translated. So huge step forward for us, especially with that dialogue injection translation getting more and more fleshed out with every update. It's huge for us and a huge step forward. So once you get this far, it's all set up and you're good to go.